Out the 8th chapter today. One of the things that happens in the... Let's get you two just over here. Just distance somewhere. One of the things that happens in the 8th chapter of the Gita is that Krishna introduces a lot of stuff which is spoken about in the Upanishads. Now, the Upanishads, like you guys have all heard of the Bible, right? So there's the Gospels, right? How many Gospels are there? There's 4. Okay? How many of them are synoptic? What does the word synoptic even mean? They tell the same story. And so, how many of the Gospels tell the same story? 3. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The book of John is somewhat anachronistic in that it just kind of goes through things in like a totally different way and doesn't tell the basic narrative of Jesus in the same standard way. It does carry some of the same stories, but if you look through the, like John the Baptist initiated or baptized Jesus in the book of Mark, which is usually thought of as being the earliest gospel. The dating of religious text, the critical examination of religious text and figuring out, when the earliest parts of the text were written and when later parts of the text were written, looking at similarities in language and differences. This whole department of historical linguistics and critical literary analysis largely came up with people examining the Bible as like a field of academic study. It really took off with biblical studies and the attempt to really understand what was going on with the Bible. And so, so in the book of Mark, John the Baptist initiated Jesus, and then in Matthew and Luke, you get little differences of stories. Like in one of them, John says, I'm initiating you, but actually you should be initiating, like that. He's like acknowledging you're above me. By the time you get to the book of John, by the time you get to the book of John, Jesus just goes down the river and there's a voice from the heaven that says you're the Messiah. And so you see an evolution in the way Jesus' initiation is treated throughout these different time strata, where initially he's initiated by John the Baptist, he's baptized, and eventually, that would be disrespectful considering he was the Lamb of God, and he was God incarnate, and the hypostatic union, he was fully man and fully divine at the same time. And all the understanding that Christianity eventually came to have of who Jesus was. And so then it became, I'm initiating you, but actually you are the chosen one. And eventually it became, there's no initiation, there's just a voice from the heavens saying you're the chosen one. Do you follow this? So you can trace out the evolution of a tradition. And there's usually this idea that the more primitive, less hagiographic, less mythologized versions are the more authentic ones. But there's no reason to assume that. It could be that, they were trying to downplay Jesus, and that the one that said that he was the Son of God and there was a voice from the heavens, that could be the original one. There's other reasons why the book of John is considered to have been written later. But one thing is you look for the earliest strata of teachings and things get added to them. So usually there's Mark is considered, that Matthew and Luke came later. They used Mark as a textbook. Then there's this thing called Q theory, Quellen theory, which is there was another source because you find in Matthew and Luke another common thread of knowledge that you wouldn't expect, and so therefore you assume they must have had another source text that they were looking at that got lost throughout time. In this way, you look through a tradition and you look at the different periods of time that a tradition was constructed, and you're able to discern, what came from where, and you're able to trace out the evolution of something. This, of course, doesn't stop. Usually people think if you could make this kind of a critical analysis, that this means automatically that the tradition itself is completely explainable anthropologically. But there's no reason to assume that. God could have worked through these people. The various teachings that were put in the Bible over hundreds of years could have been divinely inspired. That's really another conversation. Are these teachings divinely inspired? How would you determine what is divinely inspired? Do these teachings live up to that criteria? How did you arrive at that criteria? And so the Bible could be divinely inspired, and a lot of people have a hard time with looking at a modern method of critical textual analysis and at the same time keeping the faith. And they figure either it's divinely inspired, like it popped out of nowhere, or if you can show how it evolved, then it's completely explainable. And the idea of seeing it as divinely inspired is something like trying to see a ghost in the machine once you've been able to explain the machine completely. You guys follow me so far? So to be able to appreciate this stuff, you have to be able to look at all four Gospels. You have to be able to compare the information in them. You have to know the basic structure of the Bible. The letters from Paul to the Romans, for instance. The meeting of the 12 apostles, which was had, which is what the book of Acts is a history of. James's voice is one of the original apostles. How he differed, let's say, from Paul, or even from Peter. How Peter and Paul came to loggerheads and actually had an argument in the Bible. You can see an argument between Peter and Paul in the Bible. You have to actually take the time to study all this and get a sense of it. And then when you read the Bible, you can appreciate the evolution. And for some people, if they see that evolution, it breaks their faith, it ruins their faith. And for other people, they might find that it confirms their faith. That that the teachings were becoming more and more crystallized as time went on. You guys with me so far? So there's a book of literature. There's a series of books which are called the Upanishads, and they represent the esoterica of the Vedic literatures. So you have the old Veda, which is the Samhitas. They were hymns which were sung by priests, and you have the Brahmanas, which explain how those hymns are part of elaborate ritual ceremonies, and you have the Aranyakas, which are they're for the forest dwellers. Aranya means forest, and so they're for those who live in the forest. And it represents, how the texts can be used to teach one renunciation. And then you finally have the Upanishads. And Upanishad. Shad means down, or shad means to sit, and ni means down, and upa means near. So Upanishad means sit down near to a guru and ask questions, and then they answer questions, and you become enlightened. And so the Upanishads are a series of questions and answers. There are a number of them. Maybe there's 10 principal Upanishads. There's also a list of 108 Upanishads, many of which are minor Upanishads. And so they're old. They're part of the old strata of Vedic literature. They're not the oldest stratum, but they're part of what's considered to be the old strata of Vedic literature. And they deal with philosophical and spiritual teachings. And in the 8th chapter of the Gita, Krishna goes over the Upanishads. And he discusses them. And he quotes verses from the Upanishads. And then clarifies the meaning. Now, if you don't know the Upanishads and you're unfamiliar with their teachings, like Chandogya Upanishad is especially relevant for today's discussion, then it's hard to appreciate fully what Krishna's saying. You guys with me here? Okay. Anyway, the Upanishads have what's called the Devayana and the Pitrayana. Ayana means vehicle. Have you ever heard of Mahayana Buddhism? Mahayana, the great vehicle. And then there's Hinayana Buddhism. Hinayana means the lesser vehicle. The great vehicle and the lesser vehicle. Those are two different types of Buddhism. Now, Hinayana, the lesser vehicle of Buddhism, of course, is not called the lesser vehicle by its followers. It's called the lesser vehicle by the Mahayana Buddhists, who are actually a later school. So there's the original Buddhism, it's called Theravada, means teachings of the elders. And that's the original teachings of Buddhism. And then from those teachings, there grew another school, and that school identified itself as Mahayana Buddhism. And that's when Buddhism sort of re-immigrated to India. Buddhism came from India, but it came back to India, mixed a little bit with Hinduism and some yoga philosophy, worked its way up to Tibet, then worked its way into China. Came to China through two routes, through the mountains and also through Southeast Asia. And if you look at, Cambodia and Laos and Myanmar and Thailand, that Buddhism, Sri Lanka, that's all Theravada Buddhism. And then you go up into China and the Theravadas lose, and then you get Chen Buddhism, which ultimately came through China, through Tibet and through the Himalayas, to kind of two tracks. And then, they eventually made their way, Chen made its way into Japan, it became Zen Buddhism. So the Mahayana Buddhists, they call the previous school, their elders, they call them Hinayana, because they came up with this name. So a lot of times you'll see, like in a low level, you go to some college, you take a Buddhism 101 class, they'll talk about Mahayana and Hinayana Buddhism, you're like, it's a derogatory term. It was offensive to the Theravadas, the Theravadan Buddhists. If you call them Hinayanis, it's like it's insulting them. It's saying they're a lesser version of Buddhism, and this later school of upstarts is the great vehicle of Buddhism. So if you look at the Upanishads, they talk about the Devayana and the Pitrayana. Devayana and Pitrayana. And so the vehicle of the gods, or the path of the gods in this context, and the path of the forefathers. These are two terms that come up. Devayana and Pitrayana. Pitrayana, Devayana. The path of the gods and the path of the forefathers. And it speaks about people who, just to very simply, it differentiates between people who are ritualistic and desirous of getting things from their religion, and are interested in materialism but are pious. And what happens to those people when they die? versus people who are interested in divinity and spirituality and what happens to them when they die. They're both pious people. They both follow the Vedas, but one of them is ritually inclined and materialistic, albeit very pious. The other one is inclined to grab the essence of spirituality and transcend this world, and is more into renunciation and detachment. Do you guys follow this? Okay. Krishna's going to go over those two paths. And they correspond to the Uttarayana and the Dakshinayana. The path of the northern path and the southern path. The northern path and the southern path. We're on chapter 8, and we're on text 23. I shall now explain to you the different times at which passing away from this world, the yogi does or does not come back. You get it? So it's the difference between whether you reincarnate or whether you don't reincarnate. Okay. Those who know the Supreme Brahman attain that Supreme by passing away from this world during the influence of the fiery God in the light at an auspicious moment of the day, during the fortnight of the waxing moon, or during the 6 months when the sun travels in the north. There's when the days are getting longer, and then there's when the days are getting shorter. So the days start getting longer at the end of December, and they start getting shorter at the end of June. Those two times were very important for the Vedic peoples. When the days were getting longer, that was the Uttarayana. It's an astronomical term, and it refers to the actually, I don't know. It's like the trajectory of and the elliptic of our revolution around the sun. I guess we're coming closer to the sun, and so the days are becoming longer. Versus in our trajectory around the sun, we're moving further away in our elliptical. I'm not sure. You know?
It's because the Earth is tilted slightly, depending on which part of the elliptical you're on, determines how long the day is, because when you're tilted more this way, you get a little more sun.
It has to do with the tilt of the Earth and where we are in our orbit around the sun. We orbit one time around the sun every year, and we're spinning. And so it has to do with the orbit around the sun and whether you're more facing towards the sun because we're on a tilt, or whether you're facing further away from. Thank you for correcting me. So when the northern hemisphere is facing more towards the sun, and therefore the days are lengthening, that's called the Uttarayana. That's called the Uttarayana. And we're in that period now. It's a holy day called Makara Sankranti when this happened. It usually takes place in early January. And that it's considered for those 6 months from that date until the middle of the year, that's when you're supposed to die, to make it simple. Those are auspicious times to die. You also want to die when the moon's getting fuller. The waxing moon instead of the waning moon. The moon gets fuller for 15 days a month. It gets less full for 15 days a month. So, they chop it down to 6 months. Then those 6 months, half of them are lousy. So now you're down to 3 months because the moon's waning for half those months. You follow? And you're supposed to live in the daytime. So those 3 months becomes a month and a half. So you've got like this window, about 15% of the year is the right time to die for the yogis. That would be a literal interpretation of what's being said. That would be a literal interpretation of what's being said. But Krishna adds some things here. You die in the fire versus in the next one is the mystic who passes away from the world during the smoke, the night, the fortnight of the waning moon, or the 6 months when the sun passes to the south. They reach the moon planet, but they come back again. So this has the idea that you don't quite make it out of the universe. You end up recycling back into this world. Well, let's go ahead and unpack this a little bit. The fire and the smoke are things which are not there in the Chandogya Upanishad. But the language of the Chandogya Upanishad, and there's another Upanishad as well, I can't remember which one it is, but their language is, it's not Kata Upanishad. I'll have to look it up. So the language of the Upanishad is that it's the path of the godly path or the forefather path. And the forefather path means you're really attached to your family. And so you can't leave this world because you're too attached to the material bodies of your family members. And it drags you back into this world. And although your clan exists beyond one lifetime, it keeps you in this world. Your subtle attachments to your forefathers keeps you in this world. So this whole idea of worshiping your ancestors and stuff like that, which is very common in native traditions, that was there in the Vedic tradition, strongly. And the Upanishads railed against it and spoke harshly of it. Like if you're a Jehovah's Witness, they had their whole thing. There was going to be an apocalypse in 1975. They've actually had a number of apocalypses, but one of the big ones was in 1975. They had another one in the 90s. Another one was around the end of World War I. There was a few of them around World War I. And, when they had a whole thing, like, we're all going to die, and you're going to go back to heaven, and it's going to be, it's going to be real nice. We're all going to be friends. We're going to be with our family members, and we're going to live forever. The Mormons have made a whole religion out of this. But that idea is that, I find that to be a very unsexy version of, I find it to be a very repulsive version. Because it seems so kitschy that you're going to be in a back party barbecue with Jesus and your family members forever. With a white picket fence, and lions are going to come around. You'll hug them. It's all going to be fun. Somehow you get to barbecue, but you also don't hurt animals. I find a little more attractive this Native American idea, or just indigenous idea in general, all over the world, that you're connected through some kind of great chain of being to your forefathers, and that your ancestors look down upon you. That seems more like, I don't know, just more cool, more just kind of less sort of culturally specific, unnecessarily culturally specific, arbitrarily culturally specific. And the genericness of it just sounds cooler, and maybe because I wasn't raised with it, it sounds better. I wasn't raised Jehovah's Witness either, but I was raised close enough to it that that I'm not particularly attracted to it. But the Vedic idea of your forefathers was much more like a Native American idea. Also, it's all over Buddhism as well. And I think they probably got it from the Vedic tradition, but it's pretty as old as time, Your relatives die and you still feel like they're watching over you and looking down upon you, and they become some kind of mini angels that either curse or bless you through life. And that idea is as old as time, and it comes from that inability to let go. You're wanting to maintain that connection. The Upanishads just mercilessly critique that idea and point out the materialism of it. And using metaphors like two sticks that touch each other in a river and then go apart, like what actual connection do they have? Because if you start thinking about things from the perspective of you had unlimited incarnations, then the value of the material relationships you form in this lifetime, save and except for how they help you with your spiritual life, the value of them is extremely minimal. Because you've had billions, trillions of different experiences. And so the Upanishads are extremely harsh in their condemnation of attachment to your forefathers. Now, is that a critique of Native American spirituality and indigenous Mexican spirituality and African spirituality? And let's say pagan spirituality, which values very much, and even many iterations of Buddhist spirituality that very much value the connection between one and their forefathers? Is the Vedic tradition critiquing all those religions? Yeah, they are. Absolutely. If you're into forefather and ancestral worship, the Upanishads are not a fan of you. They've been criticizing you since long before your forefathers were even born. This critique existed before Buddha existed, before Judaism was on the map. You follow? It's old. This gets back to this idea of, you want to examine a set of teachings to find out if they're legitimate, if they pass muster. You got to develop a system of thinking of how to think about things and how to judge things. So, if you are not your body, and I think the idea that you are your body is just totally unworkable philosophically. I think the idea that you are your body is unworkable. Even I think atheists can't win the argument because of the irreducibility of consciousness and the primacy of consciousness and the many ways in which consciousness defies any material explanation and creates insuperable problems for material explanation from any number of lines of reasoning. But if you're a spiritualist, if you believe in God, and you believe that you exist forever, how do you work it with the idea that you're the body? You follow? How can a spiritualist hold on to that idea? It's such an impoverished notion, because your body dies and becomes literally dust. So how can that be you? If you have the potential to exist in perpetuity with divinity, you understand? It's the whole thing. It comes from God made Adam and Eve out of mud, or he made Adam out of mud, and he made Eve out of his rib, and it's then you go back to that, and then somehow by the power of God, although you're literally like dust, that's you. Somehow you get recreated. It doesn't make any sense. It's totally unreasonable. So I think an atheist has a really hard time trying to derive consciousness from matter. I think he has an impossible time doing so. What to speak of the ridiculousness of a spiritualist trying to claim that you're your body? You follow? Who believes in the eternality of the soul. Then how can you be your body, which we know is a material phenomenon, which is, you follow what I'm saying? Which has no features that make it eternal, at least in this configuration. What does God do? Come back and pulls all the space dust together and like reconstitutes you and then like breathes life into you again. Like, what would be the need for that? You'd be getting recreated. Like, why would you do that? Like, there's no sense in which you continue to exist. You live in a fully atheistic universe. But then there's a God, like some kind of mega ghost in the machine, who just puts everything back together again. It's the whole thing is just so unsophisticated. It's almost like pre-philosophical. I love all sorts of things about Christianity. But this Thomistic conception of the self, and goes all the way back to, wherever, I'm not a fan. So you can critique a tradition. And not just because your book says this, but my book says this. You can do the kind of things I'm doing now and start an argument. And point out the unreasonableness of a teaching. Then people are like, well, that's what my book says. It's like, okay. You can go in your cave. You can go back in your ivory tower and do the my book says. And even though it makes no sense and I can't defend it, I'm just going to, just repeat it on autopilot and kill you if you don't believe. You can go that route, but then there is no scope for having an interaction. But if you are willing to have a discussion about the reasonableness of various ideas, you can critique another tradition, and they can critique you. And you can have a discussion, and that's comparative religion. And so the Vedic tradition critiques the worship of ancestors. And, I think their critique is sustainable. If you're not your body, then your relationships with these ancestors is material. And therefore spirituality involves letting go of those relationships. You don't have to hate your family and run away from them, although we do that. It's called sannyas, and it's what most of our priests and gurus do. They leave their families and become lifelong celibate monks. So it's not like we don't have that. It's not like other religions don't have that either. It's not like Christianity doesn't have that. And it's not like that's not all over the place in Buddhism as well. So it's not like we're alone in this idea that, you should let go of worldly attachments and so on and so forth. You follow? But if you have this idea that you're the soul and not the body, then your attachment to your husband and wife and kids has to... it's like if you have a job. You do your job, you're attached to your job, you get your gold watch. Nobody gives you a gold watch anymore because it's just like way too much money. But it used to be, you got a gold watch after 25 years of service. Nobody retires after 25 years anymore either. But, it's like you do your job, but you don't think I'm going to do this job until the day I die. You're going to retire at some point. You're going to get your gold watch and leave, and then go get an RV and travel around the country like every other red-blooded American does. There's some idea of a planned obsolescence that I won't be doing this forever. You're getting ready to have a family, and it's going to change your life dramatically. For someone who had deeply understood the Upanishadic wisdom, they may have a family, but while they have their family, they're reminding themselves that this isn't forever. And there's a certain detachment that's built into your whole life. That these souls are under my care, but I'm going to have to let them go at some point. They're going to have to let me go. And we're all going to have to move on in our journey. And that the value and the permanence of our relationship consists of how we help one another to evolve spiritually. But this, Mormon, Jehovah Witness, kind of, low-level Christian, kumbaya, block party vision of heaven, it's not impressive. It's not impressive from this Vedic perspective when you start to really think about the nature of self as distinct from the body and what that does to all of your bodily relationships. Usually what happens is when people get a girlfriend or a boyfriend, they go insane. And they abandon their family members, and they lie to their well-wishing elders and friends, and they shamelessly lash themselves, both literally as well as emotionally, to their romantic partner. After, generally speaking, like just a number of days, and maybe if they're pious, maybe like it takes a few weeks or even a couple of months for them to become totally rabid animals. But for somebody to reject their family for their new boyfriend or girlfriend, as insane as that is the norm as opposed to the exception. Why? Because they're lusty for that person. And lust is enough for them to turn their back on their families and oftentimes their morals and make ridiculously stupid decisions driven by their passions that sometimes with absolute certainty are going to lead them to suffering. You get parents who raise their kids meticulously and instill in them virtue and values, and the moment some sexy beast walks down the road, they turn into animals and just become fools. Have you seen this happen? Have you done this? That's the proof of the intensity. That's the proof that the intensity of your attachment doesn't necessarily indicate that it's at all spiritual. Do you follow that? I'm intensely attached to my gurus. For sure, I would die for them 100 times over. 100%. I would die for them, and my family wouldn't have a father growing up, for sure. I would put myself in harm's way every time. 10 out of 10 times, 100 out of 100. No problem. You guys think you're in love. I'm in love with my gurus. They're the great love of my life. My gurus are in love with their gurus. We're part of a family. They are my forefathers. But our connection is based on attachment to truth and attachment to divinity. And that relationship doesn't dissipate. It doesn't change with the changing seasons or something paltry like that. It's permanent. It's fixed. It just gets better. It just gets more intense with time. Most people never experience that kind of intense attachment to a tradition, to elders in that tradition, to a set of teachings, to their deities. The only thing they have is their family and their spouse. It's like as deep as it goes. So when you hear this idea that like you're not the body, don't be so attached to your family, you've had millions of families, you're the soul, you're not the body, it makes you, it's repulsive. It goes so against the grain. It feels wrong. But it's not illogical or unreasonable. It's totally defendable from a philosophical point of view. You could totally explain it. I just did. You're like, well, it just feels wrong. Yeah, well, it also felt wrong to like be faithful to your family when like some new girl like came to town and you like decided to throw everything, all caution to the wind, and you were like so sure of that, and that's obviously ridiculous. You follow? So just the fact that you're pulled in one direction or another doesn't really amount to a whole hill of beans in the grand scheme of things, because people have all sorts of weird quirks and kinks and like weird little attractions to this or that govern most of their lives unexamined, and they never even try to exercise a little bit of self-control or live a philosophical, stoic, or reflective life. They just run around chasing whatever tickles their fancy at a given moment. You follow this? So forget about like getting attached to your boyfriend or girlfriend. These are people who are raised to be attached to their families and this whole great chain of being and this multi-generational culture where, it's very common in India for someone to be able to name dozens of generations of their forefathers by memory. Dozens, going back well over 1,000 years. We know the way Vedic mantras sound, partially because of the brilliance of Panini, the linguist, but also because fathers have passed on to their sons how to pronounce Vedic mantras going back thousands of years. And it's still living in the Vakanasa tradition in South India. So you're talking about people who spent their whole lives from birth being trained to be attached to their forefathers, to remember all of their names, to keep that legacy alive. And in that milieu, there was the Upanishads teaching you not to be attached to your family. And I try to give a little bit of an argument for how that makes sense. Touch it a little bit. So one thing is you got to leave during these 6 months, but during the 3 months when the moon isn't fading, and then during the 12 hours a day when the sun is shining, and so you're down to about 15% a year where you could comfortably die and go back to heaven. That's one way of interpreting it. That'd be a literal way of interpreting it. And they're using astronomical terminology. But there's this little thing in there where it says in the fire or in the smoke. And so that language has no real corollary in the Upanishads. And so Krishna's indicating that there is a metaphysical or symbolic meaning here. And that symbolic meaning, which is not here in the Gita, because the Gita speaks of an Uttarayan and a Dakshinayan, that which means the northern path and the southern path of the movement of the sun across our horizon. But if you look at the way this language is the different terms which are used in the Upanishads, you find it's the path of divinity versus the path of the forefathers. And here's the thing. If the forefathers fall, listen to this carefully. If the forefathers fall and are rejected as being a materialistic attachment and something that has to be given up by the progressive spiritualist, what happens to all the stuff we're attached to? Who's attached to their forefathers? None of you. Maybe your parents. But your forefathers indicates going back. Who's like crazy attached to their great-great-grandparents? Who even knows the name of their great-great-great-grandparents? Really?
One of them is related to President Buchanan, so I know that my great-great-great-grandfather's last
expensive till you think you qualify. Because you have found some factoid out that your parents taught you, then you remember the last name because they were related to the President Buchanan, but you don't even know his first name. So your attachment is to President Buchanan, and being able to tell people at parties that your great-great-great-grandfather is attached, to President Buchanan in some way, but you don't actually know the man. Who else said they knew? Great-great-great-grandparents. Yeah, who you got?
Not triple great, double great.
I said triple. Again, we've got very common in India that you can go back. Brahmins can go back dozens of generations. Think about that. You can't even go back 5. Okay, so what happens to all the stuff we're attached to? If you have to reject even your attachment to your great pious religious chain of forefathers that makes up a lot of religion, like a lot of religion in the world is based around ancestral worship and veneration. If you have to reject all of that, what happens to your attachment to your house? Or your car? Or your hair? Or your sexy body? Or your bank balance? Or your degree? Or your flexibility, or your strength, or your intelligence? What happens to your attachment to all of those things? It's like not even in the running. You have to give up this, and then the rest of the stuff is down here. So it's rejected. You following this today? You get this? It's a heavy cross to bear. It's the weight of a philosophy and the ramifications it has on your life and your mental construct and what you think about during your days. It's transformative. I mean, the classic Buddhist meditation is you go in Varanasi and you watch the bodies burn. You go chant your japa and watch the bodies burn. So that there's people and they're wailing and their relatives are dying and you're watching their body burn. Burning a body is gnarly. Watching a burning body is heavy. You're supposed to sit there and watch it burn. I've seen bodies burn. It's intense. You got to pack wood around the head because when the brain boils, sometimes it explodes. And you don't want to explode all over the place. You pack a bunch of wood around the head. And sometimes it doesn't explode. So you got to go and smash the skull. And then it's not like in the West. It's not like in the West of your relative. It's not like in the West, where you get this a bunch of they make a little diamond out of it or something like that, and you wear it on your ring because you're totally weird. But that's a thing, That's a thing. It's not like that. When you get the bones, they're not all turned into carbon fiber. They're still bones. You got to grind them up. Because the fire, it's not you don't burn that hot because you're burning it outside. So it's the heat of the fire you build. It's not the heat of a crematorium. You guys follow me? So you got to collect those bones and grind them up and then mix them with earth and go put them in the sacred river. What we're going to do with your father's bones. And let them go. It's like you're being trained by the Upanishads to not get too attached to this world, to not get too attached to your body, because it's all going to be taken away from you in due course of time, and to live a more Zen, stoic existence. They've also got this beautiful, amazing conception of divinity. You can fall in love with God. It's like it's kind of like the best of both worlds. You get both sides. But with this word Agni and Duma, and if you look at the commentators, everybody interprets this more symbolically. That said, they also kind of follow this literally. Very common that yogis will pass away right before the sun turns to the southern course or right after it turns to the northern course. And they'll keep it within this time period. And kind of get the double treatment. They actually do this, and it's symbolic. According to the Vedic opinion, there are two ways of passing from this world. One in light and the other in darkness. You know what the word for darkness is? Krishna. The waning moon is Krishna. And Shukla is white or light, and Krishna is black or darkness. The word Krishna literally in Sanskrit means black. The whole thing of like the all-attractive one, that's a much more philosophical, less common usage of the term. One translator, he was writing about Krishna, he called his book The Dark Lord. Sounds like almost like a Star Wars thing or something like that. Or like satanic, it was really edgy. He did it on purpose. It was a favorable book on Krishna Bhakti, but he wanted to have a sexy title to sell more copies. He called it The Dark Lord. One in light, one in darkness. When one passes in light, he does not come back, but when one passes in darkness, he returns. So this is back to this theme of like leaving this world and not coming back. There is no hell, because hell is a totally unworkable concept philosophically, that there's an eternal place. Everything's dependent on God, but there's an eternal place which is fundamentally devoid of God, although the very definition of God is that everything depends on God. Also, you've now got God who's such a crazy freak that he's going to send you to hell forever for something you do wrong in this lifetime. Like you mess up in this lifetime, and he sends you to hell forever. And even if you feel really bad and you want to get out, you can't get out. You suffer forever. Like, it's illegal to do that to people. We sentence people like 120 years in prison or this or that. We bring them up for parole. You know what I mean? But nobody gets sentenced to eternity. Like that would be like a judge. I eternally condemn you to burn in hell. And well, what to speak of? Like we put people in prison where like the guy who with the horns from the Capitol building thing. He refuses to eat. He says his shamanic beliefs are that he can only eat organic food. So they had to transfer him to a penitentiary, another penitentiary in Virginia, where they will serve him organic food because the penitentiary he was at in Virginia didn't have organic food available. So they had to actually move him to another prison because he lost like 20 pounds, that poor soul, because he could only eat organic food. And now they got to give him organic food. And like we have terrible prison care in this country. We have awful prison care. But I mean, even they get that. But now you got God sending you like a lake of fire to burn forever. It's like even if we do the death penalty, we can't do that. Even the worst criminal in the world who gets the death penalty, we can't torture them. It has to be a humane death. So you get this barbaric conception of divinity where you essentially are robbed of your free will. And so you can critique a tradition. And we have a critique. And the critique isn't just towards the Vedic tradition. It's critiquing any religion of the world which dresses up materialism as spirituality. You follow? Although the devotees know these two paths, O Arjuna, they are never bewildered. They are always fixed in devotion. It's interesting because It says the devotee, ete means these. The devotee is never bewildered by these. It doesn't say this. It says these. It's in the plural. It's not eta, it's ete, these. So that would mean that the devotee, the one who is yukta, the one who is yoga, is not bewildered by either of these two paths, which would mean that the path of devotion is distinct from the Vedic ritual. And it actually transcends even this idea of the nature of spirituality and these two paths, the path of light and darkness. As much as these paths have value, the devotee is understood to be beyond both of them. A person who accepts the path of devotional service, or yoga, is not bereft of the results derived from studying the Vedas, performing sacrifices, undergoing austerities, giving charity, or pursuing philosophical and fruitive activities. Simply by performing devotional service, he attains all these, and at the end, he reaches the supreme eternal abode. So what it says here is, Atyeti tat sarva idam viditva. Yogi. The yogi who knows this, he transcends all that. What does he transcend? What you get by studying the Vedas, by performing yajnas, by performing austerities, by giving charity, and it also transcends the fruits of ordained pious activity. The devotee transcends all of that. Yogi param stanam upaiti chadyam. And the devotee is able to achieve the original supreme abode. So it's kind of like, we could say that the devotee is that masterful Devayana, Uttarayana yogi who takes that northern path, who takes that path of the sun, who takes that path of the gods and goes back and doesn't come back to this world. That'd be one way of interpreting it. But because it says that the devotee knows these and is not bewildered by these, it's and also based on the rest of the chapter, it really seems that Krishna's trying to say there's something beyond even the pious Vedic path. There's a path of devotion, a path of bhakti. Remember, the statement that immediately preceded this entire discussion, and this is kind of the hat drop moment. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, who's greater than all, is attainable by unalloyed devotion. Although present in his own abode, he's all-pervading and everything is situated within him. This is text 22. Purushasa paraparta bhaktya labhya tu ananyaya. But the Supreme Lord, the Supreme Being, is achievable by unalloyed devotion. That's what Krishna's pressing. Now he goes and talks about the Vedic path, which is like much less about devotion and like being fixed on divinity and allowing God to take care of the rest. And he gives you this, like, it's still a spiritual path. It's still like something very powerful. It's still something very pious. It's still something very meritorious. It's still something very challenging. It goes far beyond most religions in this world. And Krishna's critiquing that. Remember how I said before, if Krishna critiques worship of the forefathers, what happens to everything else? So if Krishna transcends even the path of rejecting the forefathers and being purely immersed in spirituality, like how far up is he going up the flagpole here? Did you guys follow this? So we now have, I spent the entire class discussing these two paths, one of which was very challenging, went beyond almost any other religion you would have experience of, right? And Krishna just said, and that's not enough. There's something higher than that. You study religious texts. You perform sacrifice. You give charity. You're super pious. Devotion takes you beyond that. It's not antinomian. It's not saying how you're going to live your life. It's not saying you get to be sinful or something like that. But it's talking about the path of attachment to Krishna, of bhakti, of devotion, and the power it has of falling in love with God to revolutionize your life and transform you and change everything. That's bhakti. It's like if I have to give my forefathers, what happens to like my attachment to my new Mustang? You know? You know? To my hair, to my mustache. Like what happens to my attachment? Like the things I spend my time being pedally attached to. What happens to all that? If Krishna's even saying you go beyond this path of renunciation and sannyas and detachment from this world and rejection, like how high is this thing of devotion? How high is this path of grace? You follow? Did you guys feel it? I spent the whole class trying to set up so you guys would get this, because that's what's intended. And the only way you can get that is if you know the old path and you know the Upanishads, and then you can understand that Krishna's actually digging in and going, hey, you know what? There was one extra thing that wasn't said. And it's not just like, well, if that's a newer teaching, it's worse. No, sometimes the truth is given in installments. Sometimes, you save the best for last. Sometimes you get people to a certain level and you're like, you know what, we're going to take another level. I just want you to just lean backwards. No, we're not going to do a full back bend. You know what, we are doing a full back bend. Keep going. I got you. I'm supporting you. No, we're not going to climb that mountain. We're just going to go up here all the way and see the... Actually, we are climbing that mountain. Actually, we're getting on our hands and knees and we're going to crawl up that mountain. I remember Mason one time had like a massive bout of diarrhea while we were climbing Mount Everest. And we were just like, hey, you know what, dude? Deal with it. There's some snow, a little bit of dirt. You clean yourself up. Everything's all good. Remember that? Sometimes it's like, sometimes you save the best for last. When you look at what Krishna's teaching here about the path of grace, the path of loving divinity, it's a reasonable path. It makes sense. We can discuss it in a comparative way. We can look at the tenets and the ideas behind it. It's totally reasonable. It's not just because the book says it. It's a reasonable idea. I don't have the time to fully flesh it out. But the idea that your capacity for love, then when directed towards divinity, becomes like the zenith of perfection in life, and you were made to love, and you've been loving all the wrong people. You've been looking for love in all the wrong places. But when you turn that love towards Krishna, you find a perfect being to repose that love in, and that carries with it the ability to trump everything and transcend everything and redefine everything. And the same way you go down the wrong road when you abandon your family for your boyfriend or girlfriend, you go down the right road when you become attached to Krishna. And it puts everything in order. And it makes sense out of this world where everything's temporary anyway. And it gives you something permanent amidst all the temporary. And something real amidst all the falsity. And something true amidst all the lies. It's a beautiful concept. It stands up to scrutiny. You kick the tires on all day and night. Krishna's taken us deep through the Upanishads to the creme de la creme, to the special teachings of the Gita. And the more you understand the Upanishads and the pre-existing culture, the more you can appreciate the revolutionary, subversive, powerful, stunning teachings of the Gita. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll call it a day. Thank you, IGTV and Zoom and Facebook. Hare Krishna.